Welcome to Chew the Chat Podcast.
Firstly, thank you greatly for your time. I really, really appreciate it. You've had such an impact. I mean, I've only come across your work in the last couple of months in England. A friend of mine gave me Unconditional Parenting. As my wife and I had made a decision last year to take our children out of school, small children, out of the UK school system. Something we'd thought about for a long time. They were only 6 and 4 at the time. And a friend of mine who'd already made this decision with older children passed on your book, Unconditional Parenting, and it's just transformed and given us a real sense of perspective, and sort of our instincts have had a roadmap, if you will, our understanding of what it is we're doing. So I appreciate you greatly giving me time to talk to you today, Alfie Kohn. Welcome to Chew the Chat Podcast.
Thanks.
No problem. So what I wanted to get to with you, Alfie, is you've written around 14 books, is it? I think 14 books.
Something like that, yeah.
And you're covering education, parenting, and human behaviour, the human condition, how we interact, and how we learn from each other, essentially. Well, what I'd like to ask you is, what was your childhood like? How were you brought up? And how did this fascination start?
I'll pass on the personal autobiographical questions. I'm not as interested in talking about myself as I am in talking about the ideas that I try to represent in the books. With respect to the last part of your question, how it started for me was, I suppose, an interest in human behavior, but also in social change. And so I've long been committed to interdisciplinary scholarship, where you start with really compelling questions about the human condition that splay rudely across the boundaries that have been constructed between sociology and psychology, between literature, philosophy, and so on. And so my first book some years ago was about the idea of competition and its destructive effects at play, at work, at home, at school. And I had to draw from many different fields in order to explore the whole idea of a setup that says, I can succeed only if you fail. And it turns out there's an enormous amount of research showing that competition is inherently destructive, not merely bad if we overdo it or do it the wrong way. And that led to a book about altruism and empathy, and also to a book about why rewards, even without competition, also tend to be counterproductive at work, at home, and at school. And then I began to dive deeper into education and wrote a number of books about how to fix schools, which I see as public schooling as a cornerstone of a democratic society, but which I think needs to be done very differently from the traditional methods and goals that predominate. And then a couple of books about parenting as well. So they sort of interlock, but are all fed from the same spring of giving people more say about their lives, even really short people, and emphasizing collaboration more than competition, and aiming for deeper goals than just compliance.
So how frustrating has it been over your career, or not, to see change not happening, or to see change? Does it happen? Has it happened? Have you seen change in the education system in the US?
Yes, not nearly as much as I would like, not in as many areas or at the pace or with the intensity that one might hope. And, you know, one has to set one's expectations at a reasonable level. You know, when I wrote my book on competition 30 some years ago, if I had expected the United States to be an entirely non-competitive society within 5 years, I would have been on antidepressants very quickly, you know. But when there's indications of smaller scale rethinking of the premises as well as the practices in a society, that helps. And with respect to education in particular, no, in some respects things have gotten worse, with even more of a corporate-styled, top-down, heavy-handed, test-driven approach to filling kids full of forgettable facts rather than responding to kids' interests and needs and helping them to become critical thinkers and curious people. But there are indications that there's a resistance, that some parents join with teachers to try to improve these things and have a bit of a roadmap looking at some schools that have done it right. Just as parents, sometimes feel as if they're swimming against the tide, but there are small victories to be won. And besides, even if I'm discouraged that there's not more change happening quicker, what's the alternative to trying to move that boulder up the hill?
Absolutely. And so, being a parent yourself, were you as strong in these ideas when you first had children, or did that play a big part as well? Did that make it a much more personal, sort of close experience for you?
Yes, of course it did. But in an earlier book that I alluded to a moment ago, one called Punished by Rewards, which has a couple of chapters just about schooling, a couple of chapters just about business and management, and a couple of chapters just about raising kids, under the umbrella of a discussion about why dangling goodies in front of people to get them to jump through hoops is not only disrespectful, but profoundly damaging, just like punishments are. The couple of chapters about parenting there, which I had written before I was a parent myself, I suppose could be an indication that I was already seeing the potential application for some of these things. But I limited the extent of my comments on this until I had a child, 2 children actually, at which point I wrote Unconditional Parenting and was able to drop in some indication that, hey, I'm here too with some of the same struggles, as opposed to just being someone who looks at the research or spits out,
of course,
appealing concepts in a vacuum. I'm able to say, yeah, I'm here too, and I always will be, because I always will be a parent.
Mm-hmm. And on becoming a parent, were these ideas that you were already working towards in your mind and playing with and trying to play out in society in a wider field? Did you find them easy to sort of implement and to act out in life, or were they harder than you might have expected? And was it, we always talk about what we do in the home and then what happens when the kids go out of the home. How did you find that transition? It's trying. We're all on a journey here. If you expect if you're looking for something that's easy, that doesn't really challenge you all that much, if you're looking for a quiet home that's orderly, I think you should probably consider tropical fish instead of children. So I'm struggling with it as well. You haven't yet asked me about what those ideas were, where we sort of skipped to, was it hard for me? What's the impact? Am I frustrated? I'm wondering, can we assume that your viewers and listeners already know what we're talking about, or should we take a moment to describe what it is that I'm writing about? Well, what I should give you some insight as to Chew the Chat and what the concept is here. So obviously,
sure.
From my point of view, the podcast, Chew the Chat podcast, is born out of, and with all guests we have from all walks of life. But I'm fascinated by the first question I asked you: what happens to us in childhood? Because that seems to set a trajectory more often than not, based on love and care and connection and safety, and communal engagement as to what happens in life. So whether I'm talking to actors or reformed criminals or psychologists and so on, I always kind of go back to the start for my listeners to sort of gauge that point. Now, where we are getting to today, as you point out, is your work, and your work is the ideas that are lifelong that you've put together and written about and talked about at great length, which are Unconditional Parenting, which is the book that I can see just over your shoulder there, which is the book that's impacted me. on such a deep level because I understand what it means, in the sense that I take these ideas on my instincts. You've connected dots in my instincts for me and my wife, and then we get to sort of have a little bit of a roadmap that we can use. We're gonna raise our small children under those influences, with those values and those codes, and that will probably go on generation after generation, because that's the idea, isn't it? Is that how we raise our children, is what they value is what they take out into the world. So you and the book Unconditional Parenting, which is the one I've read first, and I've read it twice, and I will be diving into the other books as well now. What are the key, broadly speaking, are the key things that we can pick up on as parents, as new parents, as teachers? What can we pick up on and take into our lives?
Well, first, the book begins from the premise that we should be asking not, how do I get my kid to do what I tell them, but what does my child need? What do children in general need? What does my child need? And how can I help meet those needs? That's a very different question. It's focused not on mere compliance or obedience, which is, whether they put it out there explicitly or not, the driving force, the operative question of the vast majority of parenting books. How do I get my kid to clean up his room, eat her vegetables, stop fussing with her sister, take off her boots, whatever it is. And I'm more interested in what kids need. And one of the things that kids need is not just to be loved, not even to be loved a lot, but to be loved without any strings attached, to be loved for who they are, not for what they do. That's the unconditional part here. Unfortunately, most advice that's offered to parents, certainly in the UK and in the US, is all about conditional parenting. It's all about bribes and threats, or positive reinforcement and logical consequences, which are both ways of doing things to children to get them to do what we tell them, as opposed to working with children to help them grow into good people. And so a lot of the book offers a point-by-point critique of both rewards, which lead kids to ask, what do they want me to do and what do I get for doing it? And punishments, in which kids are led to ask, what do they want me to do and what happens to me if I don't do it? And an enormous amount of research finds that rewards and punishments, both versions, again, of what I'm calling a doing to approach, are not just ineffective in the long run, in part because they focus merely on short-term behavior, the actions at the surface we can see and measure, but also because they don't get to what it is we really want ultimately for our kids. So when I do lectures and workshops for parents, and by the way, and for teachers, I used to, when these lectures were done in person, when that was a thing, I would begin by asking, what are your long-term goals for your kids? How do you want them to turn out? What would you like them to be like, long after they've grown up and maybe even moved out away? And everywhere I go, I get the same kind of answers, parents for their children, and very similar answers from teachers when they're asked about their students. I want my kids to be happy, to be ethical, to be compassionate and caring, but also to be independent, self-reliant. I want them to be critical thinkers, curious, lifelong learners. People say stuff like that everywhere you go. And so what I do for a living is I say to people, you say you want this, so why are you doing that? And here's the research to show that the typical traditional approaches to both parenting and education don't just annoy me. Who cares whether I like them? They get in the way of your own long-term goals. To take a school example, teachers typically say they want kids to be lifelong learners, to get a kick out of playing with words and numbers and ideas. And yet, two practices, just to pick two of many, homework, where we make kids work a second shift after a full day at school, And grades or marks, where we rate them or worse, rank them with letters or numbers, according to all the research, makes it markedly less likely that kids will be lifelong learners. Their excitement about playing with ideas begins to evaporate because they come to see it as a chore. So I tell teachers, you have to pick. Either you are serious about the goal of wanting kids to have a disposition to learn, or you continue with practices like grades and homework. You really can't have both. Or if you do, you're playing the odds in a bad way. And for parents with raising kids, similar kinds of tensions exist between what our in-laws or parenting coaches, on the internet tell us to do, and our own long-term goals for kids, again, tend to pull in opposite direction. I'll give you one concrete example. Research has consistently shown that children who are rewarded or praised often by their parents are less generous and caring than other kids. And the effect is most pronounced if they're rewarded or praised for being generous. If I say, good job, nice work, I really like the way you shared your dessert with Diane, you're such a caring person, good for you. That child just became a little more selfish as a result, in part because you've shown her that the reason to be helpful and generous and caring and share her dessert is because she will get something out of it, namely a patronizing pat on the head from you and your approval. She's just become a little less concerned about the impact of her actions on other people. And in part, rewards, including verbal doggy biscuits, good job, is destructive, just like punishments are, because they are efforts at control. It's just that with praise and rewards, stickers, gold stars, extra dessert, and so on, it's sugar-coated control. And people don't like being controlled. And on some level, even little children get it, that that's what's really happening here. That when we praise them for pleasing us or impressing us, or, we give them a gold star for it, or a candy bar, or a high mark in school, we're not working with them. We're manipulating them, and so they become less committed to whatever they had to do to get the reward. And so at school and at home, my work is about weighing our own long-term goals against what research shows are the effects of traditional practices.
Yeah, and it's such a deep subject because culturally there's so much ingrained in the day-to-day culture of how we operate as a society, as a civilization, that
Sure.
we're just blinded at every corner, it seems. Because when I read the book the first time, as I was reading it, I would stop in the evening and say to my wife, I said, God, this isn't just about children. This is like all of us. This is how we should communicate with everybody. This is how we need to view our community and treat one another, full stop. Obviously with children it's so important because you're teaching them how to go on and into the world. Yeah, it's fascinated me. And you mentioned there, Alfie, praise and things. And I've caught myself a couple of times, and I'm sort of wrestling with this at the moment, and maybe you can help me, where my children have come to me with a drawing or with something they've made or something they've done, and I'm genuinely like, wow, that's amazing. How did you do that? And that you've done a tie on him and you've done laces on his, that's amazing. And then I've kind of stopped myself, having read the book a couple of times now, and thought, hang on, and I'm kind of a bit lost here. Maybe you can point me in the right direction. Am I praising him in the right way? Is that the genuine way because I'm genuinely happy for him, or should I mind myself a little bit? What would you suggest there?
Yeah, well, there is a chunk in the book on exactly this topic, of course. You can check praise in the index. But for those who haven't read it, I would say step one is at least you can be pleased with yourself that your temptation to praise is genuine because you're actually pretty excited about what your child has done. That already is a lot better than praise used as a calculated, manipulative device to reinforce the behavior we like. Okay? where it's actually prescribed to us. When you see your child doing something you approve of, give them that verbal doggy biscuit so you'll have more of it, as if you were training a pet, which I find just repellent in every way to treat. I mean, there are actually people who say you shouldn't even treat dogs like that, but if you haven't gone quite that far, you certainly shouldn't treat people like that. But the fact that your conscience is clear because you were genuinely excited doesn't mean that it isn't necessarily innocuous in terms of children being on the receiving end of this. First, because it's quite likely that they may become hooked on this praise, and now what they used to do for pleasure is seen as a means to the end of getting that reaction again from daddy. And so the intrinsic motivation to help, to draw, to read, to code, to play ball, whatever it is, has now been, you've devalued the activity itself by treating it as by saying, when you do this, you will get that, namely my excitement and pleasure. And the other thing that you may be doing, even if you did it for the right reasons, is to make the child feel controlled, less autonomous, less in charge of him or herself. Now I have to keep looking at mommy or daddy to see, do you like this? Is this good? And they become just a little less empowered. You didn't intend for that to happen, but this tends to happen regularly, this disempowerment, just like the diminution of intrinsic motivation tends to happen. So the first step for us is to figure out why we're doing this, because a lot of us feel it's really weird not to praise, because maybe we were praised ourselves, or we're told we have to do it, or we think in dichotomous terms. If I'm not praising, I must be criticizing. Those are the only options. It's black and white. And so we praise kids more because we have to say it than because they have to hear it. And whenever that's true, boy, is it time to sit down as you're doing and rethink your practices. What can you do here? Here, just in the specific sense of, I'm tempted to say, good job, or I really like that, honey. I don't want to overemphasize these specific fixes or changes of scripts. That's one of the points I make over and over again, is it's not just about a recipe for here's how when my kid does this, I should say the following in this tone of voice. It's much more about changing our whole way of dealing with kids and the way we look at our relationship with them, not just what do I do in this circumstance. But with respect to the temptation to praise, in the book I mentioned 3 possibilities. One is just shut up and watch. Just be there. Your kid knows you're there. If you're praising because you feel the need to, that doesn't mean it's good for the kid. And a lot of times the people who feel the most need to constantly with a good job, good job, good job, I really like that. This is not a reflection of what children need. This is a reflection of something going on with them that needs to be addressed. And it may be their need to feel in control by constantly giving these judgments. And let's be clear, praise is not about encouragement. It's not about love. It's about evaluation. It says, you've done a job, which, by the way, I find a troubling metaphor in itself for a child, that I have decided unilaterally is a good job. So it's all about judging children. That's what praise is. That's what positive reinforcement is. And that's not what children need to flourish. They need guidance. They need suggestions. They need support. And above all, they need to know that even when they screw or fall short, our love for them has not been diminished. Unconditional love. Praise doesn't just fail to provide unconditional love, it's the opposite of unconditional love. By its very nature, it doesn't matter whether you do it with these words or those words, whether you praise effort or ability, you do it a lot or a little. Praise inherently places a condition on our acceptance and approval and acknowledgement. Second, sometimes you want to say something, so you just describe. without judging. You know, when my daughter made it up the steps on her own steam for the first time at about 20, 21 months, you know, she did it. She was smiling and she turned around and looked at me and I said, "You did it." That's all I needed to say. If I told her, "You're such a good climber, good for you. That's terrific. I'm so proud of you," that would be stealing her pleasure. And I frankly don't want to raise a daughter who grows up to not be able to feel good about her accomplishments until someone in whom she's vested power tells her she's done a good job. And finally, third alternative is, which is not mutually exclusive with just describing, you know, you did it, is to ask questions. Questions where you don't know the answer, to help kids reflect on what they did. I know you really love popcorn, and I noticed you gave a whole bunch of your popcorn to Jeremy when he came to visit. How did you decide to do that? Or to take a drawing example, to follow your lead here, I notice you're drawing toes on those animals. You weren't drawing toes last week. How did you figure out how to draw those? I mean, that's a response that pulls kids into the drawing, that leads them to reflect about that. Whereas, "Good job, I love these toes," pulls them right out of the drawing, out of the value of making art, and into my face.
Well, that made me feel a little bit better, because being a little bit of an artist myself, I went off to art college and, you know, my kids draw. They love drawing, making things, playing instruments. So what I do often, the first thing I will say when they come to me with a drawing or whatever it may be, is I do notice the progression. Wow, you've done buttons, you know, you did this, you did that, you didn't do that last time. And that helps me feel a bit better about the praise then. So where I'm in a sort of a grey area, and I wonder how does this sort of bleed out into wider life as well? So what about love, when we're telling them we love them, or the affectionate side of things in those moments? How do we, or what do you advise in those moments?
I have no problem with telling children we love them, as long as in our words, in our facial expressions, in our body posture, in the way we do it and the times we do it, there's never a message explicitly or implicitly that our love is conditional on their being well-behaved or a good artist or funny or smart or do well at school or at sport or being pretty or anything. Right? As long as the message is, "I love you for no damn good reason.
Yeah.
I love you because you're you, and I always will, no matter what." Mm-hmm. Then, sure, pile it on.
Mm. And so for you, Alfie, and if this is too personal, ask me to move on. But so as your children have grown up now, and I'm not aware of how old they are, but you mentioned I think you wrote the book in 2006?
They're young adults now.
Okay, so how interesting has it been for you, seeing how this upbringing, these ethical values, this way of seeing the world that you've implemented, how has that been for you, seeing them grow and turn into young adults?
A point of pride and delight for who they are. And it's just, as a social scientist, it's just 2 data points because I have 2 children. So I'm also interested in what I learned from many other people and what research shows in carefully controlled studies. Mm-hmm. But yeah, this obviously is from my heart, is to watch them. And I will say that all of that converges on these ideas. And while I sometimes wish I had more patience with my kids, especially when they were younger, I'm not coming from a point of I do everything perfectly. You should learn from my example. I struggle too with this. But in terms of the prescriptions themselves, there's let's just put it this way. I have never gone to my publisher and said, "Oh my God, my kids are in their 20s now. I need to do a revised edition to modify some of these ideas." Yeah. The research, as well as my own experience, continues to corroborate everything I've just said about working with instead of doing to, unconditional instead of conditional, giving kids more say, avoiding rewards and punishments. So yeah, I'm I haven't gotten it all right day to day with my kids, as they would tell you, but I think the stuff in the book holds up over time.
Yeah, of course. I think absolutely. And it feels like where we are on the timeline as the world on some level becomes a little bit more conscious, a little bit more aware of our sensitivities and our, our need to, especially now, I mean, where we are on the timeline now in this very difficult time globally with schools, a lot of schools, I don't know what's happening in the US or particularly where you are in your state, Alfie, but here in the UK, all schools are shut and there's the term homeschooling is being used a lot because children are at home and they're not at school. But I kind of see it more as remote schooling because kids are logging in to laptops and being given work and having to follow protocol and adhere to this many amounts of work by the end of the day or by the end of the week. And I'm seeing like a possible moment in time where we could all reflect a little bit, which is why I'm really so pleased that you've given us time today, because these kinds of conversations I think are really important at the moment, because a lot of the news in the UK is we must get children back to school. We've got to get them back to school. They're falling behind. You know, this is going to take 12 years to gain itself back in the education system. And I'm thinking, but it could also be a really good thing in many ways in the right circumstances where people get time to reflect and actually be with the children and think about how they're learning. What are your thoughts on that and this time?
Yeah, why don't we make this the last question, then I'll try to sum up with this.
Yeah, of course.
I have mixed feelings about it. Under the right circumstances, it can be an opportunity to connect with children, for parents to take more of an active interest in and learn more about what it means for children to learn. But those circumstances are not present and may never be present for a great number of parents, and we need to realize that. You know, if I'm struggling to work 2 jobs and I'm exhausted, you know, I don't have that position. If I don't have the resources, the educational background myself, the money for a high-speed internet connection, then just to let parents do it themselves is terribly unrealistic. Also, as I talk about in my books on education, you know, being educated is not a matter of just letting kids grow on their own, confident that an acorn will turn into an oak. Nor is it a matter of just seeing kids as passive receptacles into which knowledge is poured. The very best teachers are those who understand not just their subject matter, they know a great deal about maths or about literature or history or whatever. They know a lot about how human beings learn and what's necessary to facilitate and promote that learning. And that is an art. A lot of parents feel, oh yeah, I went to school. I used to be a kid. I know how to do this. And in fact, you know, it's not necessarily the case. Just because you have teeth doesn't mean you can perform home dentistry. So plus there's a wide range of styles of schooling in classrooms or at home. There are many homeschooling parents who have, because no one's invited them to think of this differently, who just reproduce the worst traditional kinds of schooling that involves memorizing facts, practicing skills, filling in worksheets, taking quizzes, getting marks, and so on. Which is just as bad as if it happened, you know, with 20 or 30 other kids around. So it's problematic. I did write a piece recently, which, like almost everything I've written, is on my website, available for people who want to know more about this. My website, by the way, is just my name, alfiekohn.org.
We'll link everything in. We'll link everything in, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. And a piece about the idea of learning loss during the pandemic. You know, there's a lot of hysteria about that in the US. And children are missing out. A lot of them are going nuts. They miss their friends. They miss the opportunity to interact in a learning environment with real human beings instead of staring at a screen, which I'm by no means recommending. But the idea that they're falling behind just smuggles in a set of traditional assumptions about learning itself. will kids forget some of the facts that they were taught? Oh yeah, and they'll forget them anyway when they've graduated. I certainly have. But if the learning was of high quality to begin with, if, for example, they learned how to create a story that really grabs the reader, thinking about the reader's reaction instead of merely memorizing the difference between a simile and a metaphor, for example, or if they understand the idea of place value because they've constructed it, as opposed to merely memorizing the quadratic formula, or the proper way to do long division. If they know how to set up a science experiment to rule out variables rather than just memorizing facts about cell division, you don't forget that stuff. You don't lose it. If there's loss during this period of the pandemic, that's an indictment of traditional fact and skill-based instruction that they were getting for years. It's not an argument for doing more standardized testing or summer school or remedial work to cram more facts into them to make up for that. It is a mirror being held up to the traditional assumptions about learning itself. And so we have to see this as an opportunity to say, instead of just suspending standardized tests or marks temporarily because of the pandemic, this is an opportunity for us to think deeply about how schooling can and should be improved for the long term and for reasons that are not specific to coronavirus and have been there all along.
No, I appreciate that. That's a wonderful insight, and that's something we can take away. Alfie Kohn, thank you so much for your time. I know you're extremely busy. It's meant a great deal to me and to my family, and your ideas have really settled into our hearts, and they're going to change lives, and I'm sure they're doing that around the world. And I'm really, really grateful for your work, grateful for your time, and we send you peace and love and health and happiness to you and your family. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thanks. The very same to you. I appreciate your interest.